the difference between what we are told and what we end up focusing on can sometimes be so shocking, a bit like the price of cappuccino these days. It blows me away every single time, both coffee shop menus and how my brain is wired to pick up on certain information. So, I recently took my dog for a surgery, and the veterinarian mentioned that the surgery has a 99% success rate. And being a responsible doctor, he also thought to tell me that there is a 0.01% chance that she will lose bladder control and a 0.001% chance that the surgery could end up being fatal. Now, the thing is, there are more chances that she's going to get hit by a car on the road because as of 2021, about 69% of all road accidents in India happen due to stray dogs on the road. But that's not what my brain picked up on. That's not what I focused on. All I could think of was that there is a risk, not the fact that the risk is so little. And that made me think that when it comes to survival and our well being, any risk can be overwhelming. So if you hear that a vaccine can or may or could give you a heart attack, it isn't the verb that your brain is going to latch onto. It's the words heart attack. This is Sonali Acharjee, and you are listening to Health Wealth, a podcast that wants to help you understand health and develop a balanced approach towards your well-being. The reason I brought up our propensity to focus on any threat to our health is because of the recent noise and confusion surrounding the two COVID-19 vaccines, Covaxin and Covishield. Many doctors that I know of now say that patients are calling them up and they're frantic 2 years on that they could still end up getting a heart attack, and there's a fair amount of stress and anxiety for it. There are patients who are looking to sue manufacturers for any health impact that's happened in the last 2 years, whether they can or cannot establish that it actually links to the vaccine or not. So for Covishield, the worries seem to stem from the fact that there's a disclosure that the vaccine can have a very rare side effect that leads to thrombosis, which is the formation of blood clots, and that can, again, maybe lead to a heart attack or a stroke. And for Covaxin, the fears are based on a recent survey that was released. It had been done between January 2022 and August 2023 of about 926 recipients of the Covaxin vaccine, and this was done by the professors at Banaras Hindu University. Now, this survey claims that 1% of these people suffered a stroke, about half had respiratory infections, and more than 30% said that there was a variety of other problems, related to skin or nervous systems or their bones or their muscles. And about 5% of the women who took this said that they experienced menstrual issues after the vaccine. Now, the clinical trials that were done by the manufacturer Bharat Biotech for Covaxin didn't have these side effects of the BHU study. And doctors say Covishield will not have an adverse reaction 2 years after the shot has been taken. So what or who does the common person believe? You and I have not been trained in clinical trial research, nor do we understand the nuances of it. And I believe to clear the confusion, we really do need to step inside the world of research and development. Most of us really cannot understand what makes a robust, reliable trial. And before we start to believe that big pharma is manipulating all clinical trial data, I believe we should have our basics clear. So to help guide us and hopefully shine some light on what is a clinical trial, we have with us today Dr. Sanish Davis, who is the president of the Indian Society for Clinical Trials and has a lot of experience in this domain. Hello, sir.
Thank you. Thanks for having me, Sonali.
Thank you for coming. Thank you. I think it's such a relevant topic and it's been on my mind, I think since the pandemic started, since everybody started talking of phase 2, phase 1 trials, but nobody really knows what any of it really means. So I suppose the first thing that I really want to know is what is the purpose of a clinical trial? Like, who decides what the purpose is going to be?
Yeah. So the first thing, uh, and which is important to understand, is that whenever any new drug, a new vaccine, a new medical device, or even a new diagnostic device, when it has to come into the market, there has to be some form of testing. And in the world of medical research, the only way that any of these can be proved to have a benefit risk ratio, which is more on the benefit side in human patients, is by doing a clinical trial. Now, so it is more like pressure testing, right? You can do all the lab experiments, you can do testing in animals which which have human disease or mimics human disease, etc. But the proof of the pudding is in actually doing the clinical trials. And clinical trials also doesn't mean that the final dose of the drug is already decided when it is first tested in human beings.
Mm-hmm.
So
Mm-hmm.
it is more like an iterative process. So you start with actually a very small dose, which you gather information about by doing these tests in laboratories and also in animals which mimic that human disease in question. And then you arrive at what we call as the dose that you can actually test in human beings. But
Right.
even there, scientists actually take another conservative step by saying that we will not start with that particular dose which has been calculated, but sometimes we start with 1/10 of that dose, right?
Okay.
So there is
Yeah.
always the safety which kind of like becomes the foremost thing on top of everyone who's testing the drugs. And
And
within the phase,
yeah,
yeah,
please
phase one,
continue.
I
Yeah.
think you get to
Mm.
know a lot more about the drug, whether it is safe and tolerable, etc. And then it goes on to the next test, which is called as a phase two, which is in a much wider population of patients with that particular disease condition. And then the phase three, which means that you're going to test it against the standard of care or the current treatment that is given for that particular disease condition. So that entire process can, you could say, be up to around 4 to 5 years in
Wow.
duration.
Mm.
Sometimes it could take longer. The COVID pandemic was a very
Mm.
unique situation. I would say something
Yeah.
like
Yeah.
like a Halley's Comet moment for clinical research, where all this has been compressed into a year, like by
Mm.
doing a lot of things in, you could say, parallel, or they would say, compressing the whole timelines to ensure that mankind can benefit from the vaccine
Mm-hmm.
or the drugs that have been. So, in a word, I think doing clinical trials is almost paramount to, you could say, a plane manufacturer or a car manufacturer who actually would test that plane to ensure that it is airworthy, or it
Mm.
is, you could say, worthy of, you could say, being driven on the road, and it will not lead to any safety issues, etc.
Right. And it's important for all vaccines or medical equipment or drugs to go through all three phases of the trials.
So in today's world, as opposed to maybe 5 or 6 years back, where everything used to follow as phase one, then followed by phase
Mm.
two, phase three, etc. In conditions like oncology, which is cancers, regulatory agencies themselves understand the unmet medical need, and many of it is also driven by the felt need by both the physicians as well as patients for newer treatments. All of
Mm-hmm.
us want to live longer, right? And when we are living in an age where we have the means, we
Mm-hmm.
also have opportunities, we also have knowledge and information to understand the disease, etc. So when we have all of this, there is always this question that we can't wait for another 5 years for a drug which might be able to prolong the life of a person for another 5 or 6 years, right?
Yeah.
That's too much of a wait, and that's sometimes, in many people's words, it is unethical for you to actually wait that long. So some of the regulatory agencies, especially the more developed ones like the
Mm.
US FDA, have accelerated approval pathways. So
Mm-hmm.
for example, for some oncology conditions where there are there is an unmet medical need, which means that there are no current drugs which are beneficial to the patient. You can have what is called as an accelerated approval process, which means that you do your phase one in patients who have that disease condition, and it is of a sufficient duration in order to see that the drug works, that is, it's efficacious, and also that it is safe. So it's
Mhm.
essentially the benefit risk has to be more from a benefit side rather than the risk perspective.
Mhm.
And then you can actually apply for permission to market the drug on the condition that
Mhm.
the innovator who's actually bringing out these compounds will also start or do a phase 3 program, or sometimes even a phase 2b and other and I don't want to bore people with the complexities of that,
Mhm.
but
Mhm.
definitely a phase 3 program where you're testing the drug in a much larger number of population, and also to ensure that what you're seeing in the phase 1 study is what you are still continuing to see in the larger duration, the larger number of patients that you're testing in
Right.
phase 3.
Right.
And for some conditions, like again, oncology is a classical one because India is again becoming no different than the Western
Mhm.
population in many of the ways that diseases are there. So in a phase one, what you would do is that you have a marker kind of thing which actually shows that the drug actually works, and the
Mhm.
drug works well for that particular condition. But in oncology or in cancers, the proof of pudding is that the drug works and your longevity also increases. So that is
Mhm.
called as overall survival in scientific terms. So
Right.
if the drug is able to show that in the phase one setting, it is able to show benefits, which is called as progression-free survival, which is a shorter duration assessment of how the drug works. And in phase three, it shows that the overall survival is also really good, which means that the patient is benefiting from the drug and the disease is also at bay. Then
Mm.
that's a great marriage of, you could say, the phase one and the phase three data, and the drug can continue to be marketed, etc. So these
Yeah.
are ways in which the regulatory science is also advancing, so that patients don't have to wait for 4 or 5 years for
Mm.
that drug to come to the market. For maybe if my relatives have an illness, I wouldn't want 4 or 5 years to
Yeah.
wait for that drug to come through, right?
Yeah. No, actually, I find the back end of what goes on behind the scenes of drugs so fascinating because, there's always a fear of side effects. It's something I don't know why our brains just want to know. Any medicine that's ever given to me, the first thing I want to know is what are the side effects. And then when you hear that how much of thought and design goes into ensuring that they're safe, it does instill a bit of faith in the system. But having said that, there are a lot of studies and data out there which are a little less than reliable. Now, for an expert, they can see it. So I mentioned the BHU study, and I believe ICMR wrote a letter to them. And there were a couple of things that they pointed out that the study didn't have a control group of unvaccinated individuals. It didn't mention how frequently these adverse events were reported. It didn't do a follow up physical examination or a clinical examination, so it's not very certain whether the patients were making it up or if it was actually true. And it didn't follow the globally accepted definition of adverse events of special interest. Now, these are things that experts or those in the field can see and they can understand. But as a common person, if I come across trial data or I come across research, is there a way in which I can tell if this is reliable enough or not?
So there are, of course, on the internet, there are
Mm-hmm.
several organizations which can actually provide more explanations or
Mm-hmm.
details about what the drug does,
Mm-hmm.
how does the drug act, what do we know about this disease or the treatments that are already used for this disease from the past, and how does the result of this study, you could say, compare with what is already known or what is already available. So there are several websites that are there. Once you could say there are several of these institutions, the National Health Service in UK, Even in
Mhm.
India, we have several of the institutions like TMH, etc., Tata Memorial, All India Institute, etc., which do bring out data to actually educate. But the only thing is that you need to know where to look for it, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's the
Yeah.
challenge. So
Yeah.
while we are on that topic, I think the very fact that how do Indian patients get to know without their doctor telling them that where to go and look for information about participating in a
Mhm.
clinical trial, right?
I agree.
So if you ask the man on the street, out of say 50 people that you ask this question, maybe one person might be able to say that there is something like a registry that is publicly available,
Mhm.
which provides great amount of information about the trial, which all are centers where the study is ongoing, what can you expect in that trial, what is the inclusion exclusion criteria, are you going to be eligible, etc., etc. So
Mm.
that all that information is there, but somehow that website has not been designed with the normal lay person or the patient in mind,
Mhm.
right? Because the keywords that you have to enter is more scientific in nature rather than say
Yeah.
general things like say for example cancer of the lung.
Mm.
If you just put that, you will get data, but it will not tell you which kind
Mhm.
of studies are being done at which place, etc. So
Yeah.
we have been in talks with ICMR and others to
Mhm.
kind of like because they are the custodians of this registry, right?
Right.
And this registry also mandates that all the trials that are done in India
Mhm.
should also have their results being populated there, right?
Mhm.
So that's also a requirement. So it's not only a trial registry,
Mhm.
but it also can be accessed by the public on the results of the study. So you have something like this. Now, the only thing is that with artificial intelligence or AI and machine learning, etc., can the government go another step forward and synthesize the results of the study or this trial into common layperson
Yeah.
language and
Mm.
provide it there, right? That could be the next, you could
Yeah.
say, evolution of it. And
Yeah.
there are discussions and thoughts and other things which are also happening on that perspective. So pretty much I think this is the direction that you could say the government is willing to actually look at. These are the kind of conversations that we are having. There are also patient advocacy groups which have been asking the government to actually get this done, or because
Mm.
a community of people with colorectal cancer or lung cancer or people with, you could say, rare diseases, etc., there's no way to easily get that information,
No.
right? You really need to know what keywords to key in, etc.
Mhm.
And not everyone would have the help of somebody who can actually help in these kind of things. So this is the evolution that we want science to take. This is what will benefit our patients in India. And this will also help them to understand what is clinical trial. Because
Mhm.
when you have access to information, you will actually ask questions. You'll start to kind of like question, why is it like this? Why can't this trial happen also at another center? And all those kind of
Mhm.
things, right?
Yeah.
That'll open more further inquiry, further information, further knowledge, etc.
Yeah. No, I always find it so fascinating that the information is there. It's always there. So I was doing a story on the drug semaglutide, and one of the versions, Ribelsis, is there in India. And because we didn't do the trials here, the best I could do was I wanted to know on what basis was it approved. And all the minutes of every meeting between the manufacturers and the regulator is available online. I was shocked, how detailed, minute by minute, it's there. It's just something you won't really think of, and it's very, like you said, very difficult to find it. Speaking of the regulator, I know this, but I just for the benefit of someone who might not know, who are the regulators in India?
Yeah, so the regulatory agency in India is called as the Central Drugs Control and Standard Organization, or
Mm-hmm.
CDSCO. It's headquartered based out of New Delhi. and it works under the Ministry of Health and Family Affairs, right? So
Right.
that's the MOH and FW department under which the CDSO actually works.
Right.
Now, the CDSO is headed by Dr. Shri Rajiv Raghuvanshi, who's the Drugs Controller General of India. He's the de facto the chief of CDSO or DCGI, right?
Right.
Now, they
Right.
are the ones who approve, who review the data, who have, provide approvals, who also look at the safety of the drug, which is called as the discipline of pharmacovigilance or drug safety. They also do a lot of public health related activities because usage of drug is not just in an individual person, right? It is across the population. So
Right.
are there any safety issues that are relevant to India? Do you think that we see anything which is like because maybe the body mass index of Indian population might be lower than maybe other parts of the world? Does this drug do something differently? So they do a lot of these public level education and public safety information dissemination, etc. So the role of CDSO is not just for reviewing and approval of giving drugs, but it encompasses the whole spectrum of public health. You could say public health usage, public health knowledge and information sharing, and several others, including policy making,
Right.
advocacy, etc.
Right. One of the things, you mentioned this, and I just wanted to get your opinion. Is it important for a drug or a vaccine to be tested in an Indian population for us to believe that it's really safe? Like something like, say, Ribelsis hasn't been tested in India, but I believe a few Indians were part of the larger trials, but there hasn't been a separate trial here. So is that important?
Yeah, so in today's time, there are many drugs which have very clearly identified safety parameters and risks which are identified, right? And the whole field which actually talks about is there any genetic or any other differences between the Indian population or the population of Indian subcontinent, if I may put it that way, versus maybe the population of outside of India, like maybe Caucasian or you could say Eurasian or Hispanic and all these population. There are many ways to actually decide whether these populations are similar or are there any differences that are there. So this whole science is called as the science of pharmacogenomics, right?
Okay.
How your genetics or your genomics actually influences the effect of drugs in your body. Now, there have been several studies, and these studies have actually shown that, of course, there could be differences between different parts of the world. But the reality is that the pharmaceutical R&D process doesn't look at, you could say, making a drug only for a American population or for Indian population or Chinese population, etc. You would want to have a drug which works across the globe, can work across racial, the sex, you could say age group, and whatnot, even the distribution systems. The same drug that is launched in India has to work in the colder temperatures in maybe Jammu and Kashmir, and also the hottest temperature maybe in Nagpur, which
Yes,
might even
exactly.
climb up to 44. So no pharmaceutical R&D development, whether it is Indian or multinational, tries to actually develop drugs which are only for a specific population. It's more like for a global audience. And it has to work across. It has to work across patients who take Ayurveda, Chinese traditional medicine, Unani, Tibi, you name it. I mean, there has to be the drug which can actually work across the system.
Yeah.
So many of these pharmacogenomic variants, what we call as the ethnic sensitivity of this thing, are well identified, right? While the drug is getting, you could say, developed.
Yeah.
Now, if there are anything which are very specific and say, for example, a drug which might lead to a high increase in the blood concentration in a particular
Mhm.
population, those
Mhm.
can easily be identified during the development stage itself. It doesn't have
Mhm.
to kind of like wait for a whole lot of time to actually say that, oh, we didn't think about it or we didn't
Mhm.
know about it. Those
Mhm.
kind of scenarios are very difficult to happen in today's time.
Mhm.
So then the question happens that, do you need to test the drug which has been tested globally in the Indian population all over again?
Mhm.
And in the published literature, because we can't say about what is not there in the published literature. In the published literature, it is very difficult to see that there is huge number of drugs which have an issue, right?
Mhm.
There could be. I mean, I'm not saying that science can always be 100%,
Right.
you could
Yeah.
say, without any even a iota of chance where it can go wrong.
Mhm.
But the reality is that, do you want to actually test every drug where Indian population has not been there in global
Mhm.
studies because of several reasons? It could be because the study could not be done in India, or we
Mhm.
don't have that population which can actually be recruited very quickly so
Mhm.
that the study can be completed, etc. So
Yeah.
sometimes you need to really think through whether do we have enough public data or published data which says that there is a huge difference between what is the drug which is approved globally versus what is approved in India. If
Yeah.
there are no significant ethnic sensitivities that are identified during the development of the drug, it is highly unlikely that there will be a difference that can be found out by doing costly additional studies
Yeah.
just for Indian population, right?
Yeah. That makes sense. You mentioned that there can be reasons that a study can't be done in India as well. What would some of them be? What are the challenges of doing trials in India, and how do we sort of, get to a point where perhaps we would be the preferred destination for trials?
Yeah. So if you look at the whole scenario which has changed, and kudos to the government as well as the regulatory agencies for bringing
Mm.
those changes. In 2019, we had the NDCT rules, which is the new drugs and clinical trial rules for India. And,
Mhm.
and the NDCT rules also kind of, in a way, has been one of the bulwark of, you could say, how the COVID vaccine and others had a faster
Mhm.
approval, etc. Because things were laid out much more in clarity
Mhm.
in the way that it needs to be there, so that people who are developing the drug had something to kind of like go by. So the NDCT rules actually very clearly laid out what should be the approval timelines for you could say clinical trial review and approval. What are the things that are required? What kind of documents are required? What kind of testing has to be done before it can be brought to the
Mhm.
clinical trial, etc. So it's very well laid out. Now, global drug R&D is like a behemoth. It's like a massive process, right?
Yeah.
You have
Yeah.
like 40, 50 countries who are all vying for being part of clinical trials, etc. Now, if you have these big countries like US, China,
Mm.
Japan, all of them have within their regulations very clearly stated requirement that if if you need to have the drug launched in these countries, you need to have X number of patients to be exposed to the drug, right? Now, that means that there has to be that number of patients who has to be, you could say, kept aside for that particular drug development, because
Mhm.
those are reasons of science which determine what should be those numbers.
Mhm.
Like, for example, Japan has patient population which do behave very differently sometimes from the Caucasian population.
Right.
Similarly, I think Chinese population also, they have found data that in some occasions it might you could say do differently. Now, post COVID, the scenario is that every country has also had a realization that if we don't have these, you could say, cutting edge technology related trials
Mm.
in our country, there could be a chance that our population may not even have an access to these drugs, right?
Mhm.
Or vaccines, you name these things. That has led to something like a global clinical trial arms
Yeah.
race.
Right.
And what that means is that countries or their regulations are gearing up to kind of like give approvals at a faster rate.
Mm-hmm.
For example, India has a stated regulatory approval timeline of 90 working days,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
So typically 90 working days will translate to around 4.5 months on calendar basis.
Mm-hmm.
One of our immediate neighbor, Malaysia, has approval times which are between 1 to 2 months, everything put together, right?
Right. Right.
Poland, another country
Mm-hmm.
which recruits a lot of
Mm-hmm.
patients on clinical trial, their
Mm-hmm.
approval timelines are crunched to probably 1 month, etc. The United States have a deemed approval in 30 days. So you
Mm-hmm.
put in an application within 30 days. If you don't hear back from the US FDA, it
Mm-hmm.
means that on the 31st day, you can start the study. So the
Mm-hmm.
ball is in their court.
Mm-hmm.
Now, we have seen a lot of changes from the CDSO in the timeline that is there. But when you put on paper the timelines of all the different countries, etc., India kind of like comes to maybe the last 1/3 of the countries where clinical trials are being done.
Mm-hmm.
What does it mean? We don't become very competitive, right? We are
Mm.
always struggling to get studies.
Mm-hmm.
We have to fight to actually get these studies in India. The size of the population is a big determinant, and
Yeah.
there I think we have a huge advantage because some of the disease conditions we can get it here in many
Mm.
ways. But if you look at the early stage studies like your phase ones and your phase two studies, which are very early, where you could say get a sense of how the drug works, R&D organizations would rather go to countries where things are much more predictable, right?
Right. Right.
And there we lose out, right?
Mm.
And that I feel is something which is a huge disservice to the Indian population,
Mm.
because while we get phase three studies, etc., it is much ahead in time, right?
Yeah.
But if just imagine a scenario where the drugs development is happening in India, the
Mm.
phase one, phase two, etc., there is a wealth of knowledge on the safety of the drug, the
Mm-hmm.
tolerability of the drug, the efficacy of the drug, which can be generated in our patients.
Right.
And that will also give the regulatory agency much more confidence in the data that the local population data will bring in, right?
Mm-hmm.
So if we have to get to that stage, we have to kind of like be able to crunch our regulatory approval timelines.
Mm-hmm.
The ISCR's request has always been that if we can get it at least within 45 days,
Right.
calendar days,
Mm.
then that puts us in a very, very competitive situation
Yeah.
in order to attract, you could say, cutting edge technology and cutting edge trials to them. Now, getting trials itself is not the end all of it.
Right.
The end all is, of course, the patients also benefit,
Mm.
right? Right now, when clinicians, whether it is cancer, whether it is immunology conditions, etc.,
Mm-hmm.
clinical trials are not an offering right now.
Mm.
It is more like uh, doctors who are much more research oriented would actually say that, okay, if nothing works, then let's see if clinical trials are an opportunity.
Mm-hmm.
Many patients also have no clue about clinical trials and the opportunity that bring.
Mm-hmm.
But if the change happens where we have larger number of studies which are coming in, doctors would also be able to say that clinical trial is also one of the care options.
Mm-hmm.
Just like another drug treatment, clinical trials is also a care option.
Mm-hmm.
Patients get benefited, and it has been proven several times over that when patients are in a clinical trial, they get looked after better
Yeah.
because
Yeah.
there is much more regimented approach
Mm.
to actually having their follow-up. They need to come back to the doctor. The doctor also ensures that the clinical trial participant gets a better, you
Mm-hmm.
could say, opportunity to meet with them, talk with them, etc., etc. So it's all very beneficial to the patient. And the
Yeah.
patient also gets this as a care option rather than when everything else is over, etc.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Yeah.
And look at our institutions and the benefits that happen. We ISCR strongly believes in Make in India and Make in India for the World
Mm-hmm.
policies of the government, right? But for that to happen, our institutions also should be able to get this expertise.
Right.
That
Yeah.
expertise will come when we do larger and larger number of studies.
Mm-hmm.
And then the institutional ethics committees will get exposure, the doctors will get exposure, and everyone who's part and parcel of this ecosystem will be able to kind of like over a period of time do their own research, right?
Mm-hmm.
Build
Mm-hmm.
their own compounds, build their own molecules. So you will have, just like in the West, research institutions in India bringing out their molecule, which ultimately will get picked up by big pharma in India, and then that becomes like a partner, you could say, a revenue model for the institution, etc. So that is how the country will progress, and the country
Yeah.
will, you could
Yeah.
say, become better and better.
So you mentioned timeliness matters of the regulatory approval, and also India already has an advantage of a fairly large population and diverse population. Does price play a role in any of this? Is it cheaper to do a trial here?
So if you look at the large clinical development organization, you look at any of these companies who are there, etc., for them, clinical development price is not a concern.
Mm-hmm.
For them, the most important things are quality of the data,
Mm-hmm.
timeliness of the data points or the approval and all the other things. So when you can start the study and when the study can end, right? I mean,
Right.
that's a timeline that is looked at. Cost comes as probably a distant third or fourth sometimes, right?
Okay.
And
Right.
it really doesn't matter, because
Mm-hmm.
the uh, if there are already 40 countries who are already in the fray, right?
Mm-hmm.
Adding one more country will not suddenly decrease the
Mm-hmm.
amount. But what
Right.
if India became one of those frontline countries which actually is able to do large volume studies?
Mm.
Then I think cost will become a bigger impact. And I,
Yeah. Yeah.
I do. I mean, I'm not, you could say, not willing to say this, but I would think that then maybe costs can even come down in the future, right?
Mm.
Because if
Yeah.
you have a country where large volume studies are being able to done, our institutions are all ready, etc.,
Mm-hmm.
naturally, I think we can actually bring down the cost of drug development in many ways.
Yeah. And to do a trial you need clinical researchers as well. It's been, I mean, I've never actually heard of anyone I've known who says that my dream is to be a clinical researcher. How do you sort of bring more people into the fray? How do you inspire people to join this field now?
Yeah, so clinical research is never has been a discipline in medical field, right?
Mm-hmm.
If you look at our MBBS curriculum or our MD or our DM or MS or MCH curriculum,
Mm-hmm.
uh, clinical research as such was never a discipline, right? It was always like something good to do. Maybe you do some research and then maybe you publish a paper and then you can actually get to your next level, etc.
Right.
Over a period of the last, I think, 10 years, I would put it, maybe the National Medical Commission and the erstwhile MCI, etc., put having to do research as one key goal for promotions in medical colleges or medical institution for your grade and designation, etc.
Mm-hmm.
So that has given some fillip to, you could say, doing more of research. But I guess if you look at the vast number of medical colleges that are there is no mandate that they should be doing clinical research or clinical trial. For those who are actually, you could say, doing research, they continue to do research in spite of all the challenges that are there. But for those who don't do research, it's not a mandate that unless you do research, anything will happen to your grades or to your
Mm-hmm.
promotions, or you could say any of these other things. So that incentivization might actually work in the benefit of people to actually consider clinical research as a good thing.
Mm-hmm.
The second thing is that we continue to lack what we call as the physician scientist, right? Uh, uh, our healthcare is still very much oriented only towards patient care. But if there is an opportunity for at least the faculty in medical colleges, etc., say that maybe 25% of your time is protected time. And that protected time is for research, writing papers, publishing things, educating the next level of investigators or researchers on how to do research, the methodology of research, etc. That will actually make a huge change in the way it is. Currently, I think many of our, you could say, tier one, you could say, institutions of national importance do have some form of protected time. Not saying that there is something which is there very well laid out,
Yeah.
but there is some form of protected time in some of the institutions. And people who are researchers themselves who then become administrators in these institutions then
Mm.
kind of like encourage this as a requirement. But
Right.
unless there is a way in which you can have clinical research as a discipline
Mm.
within both medical, pharmacy, and sometimes even nursing,
Yeah.
it's very difficult for us to actually create the next generation of workforce, right? If India transforms with all these changes that are there and make in India, innovation in India, etc., you'll suddenly feel that there are no people to actually do all this work that comes through. So there
Yeah.
has to be skill development also,
Yeah.
which kind of like happens. And that will happen only when you have these disciplines incorporated into the education.
Yeah.
That's the only way that things will kind of like start moving.
No, I was actually thinking that to be in clinical trial research, you have a patient coming in. How much of people skills one would require to, make sure that we stay in touch, we come back, we follow up, we feel safe. Because if I were to participate in a trial, I would be quite worried. This is an untested medicine. So to have those skills, it must be so important and also so incredibly exciting. I think it's a pity that we don't know about this field when we are in school. Now it's a little too late for me to become a trial researcher. But I started this podcast talking about the COVID-19 vaccines because, it's all over the place now. Um, is it fair to say that 2 years after you've taken a vaccine or a drug, that the health impact is because of that medicine or that vaccine, and can it actually be traced back? Like, say I take a medicine today and 2 years on my digestion is messed up and my gut bacteria has changed or something, can I then go back and say, no, that medicine was the reason, my digestion got spoiled?
Yeah, so in the specific case of COVID, and I'm not a COVID researcher
Mm,
who would actually do this on a day in and day out basis, but it also begets that question that do we really know fully well about the virus itself?
mm,
Because there are several papers that are there in the public domain which actually even ask the question about what does this virus do maybe after 3 years,
mm.
and
Yeah.
is it the effect of the vaccine or is it the effect of the virus?
Mm,
We the jury is still out, right? Now, then to answer the question that how do we pinpoint if a particular adverse event or a particular, you could say, bad effect or the side effect of a vaccine has now manifested itself, and it has always been, you could say, lying dormant in the person's system, and it has now manifested itself. So if you look at majority of the side effects that are being projected in the media and the others,
mm.
many of them actually happen during the initial period of the vaccine,
Yeah.
right? So the common one, like the thrombotic,
Mm,
say the
mm,
TTS, as they say, an effect of vaccine which is well known, well researched. The
mhm,
numbers are there, which actually say how many
mhm,
within a 1 million population, how many would get it, etc. But anything which is beyond maybe 1 or 2 years or 3 years, etc.,
mhm,
it's sometimes very difficult to actually make a causation and an effect analysis which might stick for everyone, right?
mhm,
Sometimes it might be true, sometimes it might be maybe a random effect which could be an interaction of what is happening in the environment, what is happening within the body itself, the interaction of what the virus could have actually brought in or some other thing. So there are several epigenetic or epiphenomena, as they say,
Yeah.
which will make it very difficult to actually pinpoint what is the reason. What is
Mhm.
well known is what is characterized for the initial period where these side effects are there, because that is the most research.
Mhm.
But the question is that if somebody asks that, oh, we were given a vaccine which wasn't fully researched, the question is that will you wait for 5 or 10 years before you actually
Yeah.
take the vaccine,
Mm.
or would you actually take a vaccine which has been generally being proven to be safe, side effects have been well delineated, and it is the what was the need of the hour.
Mhm.
There was no way that you can say that without the vaccine, you would not have got the infection.
Yeah.
Forget about you, maybe somebody else would have got the infection because you were not vaccinated, right?
Mhm.
So
Mhm.
those are, you could say, very intuitive thoughts that I can say. And let me be very clear that I'm not a COVID researcher.
Yeah.
I'm
Right.
not even somebody who has worked so much in COVID vaccines, etc. We, of course, had research on COVID vaccine, but I'm not the expert there.
Mhm. No, I understand. But you have given us a lot of knowledge on trials and research, which I think is very important because it's okay to be scared and worried about your health and what's being given to you. But to make choices, you need full knowledge, not half knowledge. So if this podcast helps somebody, get inspired to read a bit more about a clinical trial and really find out how much of effort and thought and research has gone into a drug, then that's really great. So thank you so much for sharing this with us. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sonali.
Thank you. I personally would love to read a book written by a clinical trial researcher.
Hmm.
A couple of months ago, I had to interview the director of the ICMR National Institute for Research in Tuberculosis. Her name is Dr. Padma Priyadarshini.
Priyadarshini, yeah.
Yes, and she talked about, for a little bit, she talked a bit about what goes into a clinical trial research. And for me, that was so inspiring and exciting, to talk to a patient, to find out what are the effects, to make sure they're not lying, to make sure they come back. And, it was really incredibly inspiring for me. And I realized then that for every medicine I put into my body or every vaccine I inject into my skin, there is an entire ecosystem of people and doctors and patients who are working to do this. And it would be so wonderful if they came out and talked a little bit more about their work. Have you ever participated in a trial in India, and would you ever do so? And do you have faith in clinical trials in India? Has this episode helped you gain a new perspective on clinical trials? Do let us know your thoughts. You can write to us at pods@indiatoday.com, or you can message us on 8588966996. We are also available on any social media channel of your choice. And if you enjoyed this episode, please do leave a rating. We're there on Apple, Google, Spotify, and YouTube.